What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into my way too early top 10 rankings for the wide receiver position going into the 2023 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy the content today, hit that like on the way and hit that subscribe button down below. Be sure to drop a comment. Let me know what wide receivers did not make the list that you think should be there, and if you guys agree or disagree with the rankings overall. Keep in mind, while we go through today's videos, any of the stats you see are only going through week 17 of the 2022 fantasy football season. There are no week 18 stats including in the rankings that I have for you guys, or the stats that I have for you guys, since a majority of the fantasy community only plays through week 17. That is what I am looking at when I put together these lists for this series I'm doing. Nonetheless, let's hop into today's video. All right, first on the list, I've got Justin Jefferson. No surprise here. A lot of fantasy managers' favorite receiver coming into the 2022 fantasy football season, and he will remain a lot, if not all, of fantasy managers' favorite receivers heading into the 2023 fantasy football season. Obviously finished as your wide receiver one on the year for 2022 at 179 targets, 124 receptions, 1,771 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns, over 360 fantasy points on the season in full PPR scoring formats. Averaged 9.89 yards per touch, averaged 14.28 yards per catch. Just an absolutely phenomenal season out of Justin Jefferson, and we can expect this offense to look very similar going into next season as well. There's really not a lot to discuss here. JJ dominated this season, and there's just really no other wide receiver who's close to that #1 overall spot. I think the next couple receivers are in a very high, very elite tier, but right now JJ is the solidified #1 wide receiver as we approach the coming fantasy football season. All right, next up I've got TYREEK Hill, which might kind of surprise you guys. There's a lot of kind of debate when we get into the next couple wide receivers, but I really just want to look at what TYREEK Hill did this past season in 2022. He's going to be the wide receiver 2 through the first 17 weeks of the season. Just an absolutely great year for TYREEK Hill. 341.9 fantasy points in full PPR, 165 targets, 117 receptions, over 1,600 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns, 14.42 yards per catch on the season. A great year for TYREEK Hill. I think the biggest argument coming into the season for the Dolphins and their skill position players was obviously the quarterback position, and I know Tua has been banged up throughout the season. I think he should take as much time as possible to heal up from the concussions he suffered this year, but ultimately you could debate that there's a little bit of a question mark looking at the quarterback position for the Dolphins next season as well, but I just don't think it matters. It did not matter this past year. It did not matter when it was Patrick Mahomes or one of the Chiefs backups. And I mean, I get that Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes, but at the end of the day, man, TYREEK Hill is going to ball wherever he is as long as he's fully healthy. I really think, out of respect, we have to consider him in the top 3 wide receivers going into next year. When I've been conducting mock drafts with you guys so far on the season, we don't have TYREEK Hill going really in the top 5 wide receivers. I think we need to put a little bit more respect on Hill's name after the monster year that he had. So I've got him as my #2 receiver going into 2023. All right, #3 overall, I've got DAVANTE Adams, who was your wide receiver 3 on the 2022 fantasy football season. Just a monstrous year for Adams, over 323 fantasy points in full PPR through the first 17 games of the year, 95 receptions, over 1,400 receiving yards, and 14 touchdowns. Just a great year overall, whether it was Derek Carr at quarterback or Jared Stidham, and I think that's going to be the big question mark, similar to TYREEK Hill, but far more of a larger question mark for the Raiders and DAVANTE Adams going into next season. Who will be the quarterback for the Raiders. We know Derek Carr will be departing from this team. I don't believe that the Raiders envision themselves moving forward with Jarrett Stidham. They're going to draft a quarterback. Is it going to be Tom Brady? Whatever it may be, I don't care. I begged you guys to draft Davante Adams going into the 2022 season. I thought he was wildly undervalued, and I have a feeling he will be undervalued next season as well. As long as he is fully healthy, he is an absolute game changer. I love him as my third receiver going into 2023. All right, fourth overall, I've got Ja'Marr Chase. A fantastic year for Chase when he was healthy, as expected. In every game that he started and played in, he gave you 10 or more fantasy points, double digits in every single game. So when we look at things overall, he played 12 games of the first 17 games, missed 5 games on the season, still is going to finish as your wide receiver 15 through the first 17 weeks of the season. Over 218 points in PPR, 79 receptions, 960 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. All things considered, missing 5 games, very good numbers. And honestly, you could argue that Chase should be higher on this list. You know, if he was fully healthy, he definitely would have had the opportunity to be in front of guys like Davante Adams and Tyreek Hill. But ultimately, he missed 5 games, so he's a little bit further back on the list. But like I said, going into 2023, if you want Chase on your fantasy team over any of the receivers that we've gone over today, I honestly cannot blame you. We know what Ja'Marr Chase is going to bring to the table on a weekly basis, and he's going to be a stud in 2023. Right, next up on the list, I've got Stefon Diggs, your wide receiver 4 in 2022, 297.8 fantasy points in full PPR for Diggs on the season, 103 receptions off 146 targets, over 1,300 receiving yards, 10 touchdowns, 13.12 yards per catch. You know, I really felt like coming into the 2022 season, Diggs was pretty undervalued. There's a lot of kind of division going into the season on where to draft Stefon Diggs. There were people who really considered him coming in the season a top 5 receiver due to the offense he was tied to in the Buffalo Bills. And you had a lot of fantasy managers who just weren't very high on Stefon Diggs, or at least the draft capital you had to spend on him. But if you did spend your draft capital on him early, it absolutely paid off. He had one of his best seasons of his entire career, an absolutely great season for Diggs. And I really don't think this Buffalo Bills offense is slowing down anytime soon. We know that Diggs is locked up with the Bills. We know that Josh Allen is going to be there one way or another. Diggs is in line for another great season in 2023. All right, you know, we need to talk about Cooper Kupp at some point. I really think it's pretty crazy when you think about it. Cooper Kupp finishes as your wide receiver 21 through the first 17 games of the season, over 200 fantasy points in full PPR, 75 receptions, 812 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. But we all know, obviously, the ankle injury, surgery, everything, missed a majority of the season, only played 9 games, so missed exactly half of the season and missed about 8 games in terms of the fantasy season, right? At the end of the day, the pace Cooper Kupp was on was absolutely crazy. I mean, he still had 6 touchdowns on the season. That ties a couple of receivers that we're going to talk about today. He gave you 16 or more fantasy points in every start that he played in this year. He gave you 22 or more fantasy points in every game he played this year except for 2. We know Cooper Kupp is an absolute stud. I am of the belief that Matthew Stafford is going to play next year. If he does not play, I don't really think it matters. Cooper Kupp is still a top 10 receiver going into 2023. And honestly, you could argue he should be a little bit higher on today's list. We've done a couple of mock drafts for the 2023 fantasy football season here at the channel with you guys. And we've seen Cooper Kupp go as a wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 in a couple of these mock drafts. So people are still very high on Kupp for very good reason. Hate the fact that we missed Kupp for about half of the year, but he is going to ball one way or another going into 2023. All right, next up on the list, we've got CeeDee Lamb. A very good year for CeeDee. Kind of took that step forward that we had been waiting for him to do. And, I think it's kind of unfair to consider this a down year for CeeDee for a couple reasons. Obviously, he missed Dak Prescott for part of the regular season, so the passing ability for this offense was limited for a couple games. And on top of that, he was your wide receiver 6 on the year. I just haven't seen a lot of acknowledgement for what CeeDee Lamb did on the season. At the end of the day, over 285 fantasy points in full PPR, 102 receptions, over 1,300 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns, 12.8 yards per catch. A very solid year for CeeDee Lamb. Overall, only gave you single-digit fantasy performances in 3 of his starts on the season. Outside of that, 10 or more fantasy points in every other game. And like I said, he got some of that done with a backup quarterback in Cooper Rush. I really don't think this Cowboys offense is going to look too different next year. At the end of the day, CeeDee Lamb is the undoubted wide receiver 1 for this squad. I think there's no reason to believe that CeeDee Lamb won't have another great season going into 2023. All right, next up on the list, we've got A.J. Brown, your wide receiver 5 on the 2022 fantasy football season. A great year for Brown. Made a lot of big strides in his first year with the Philadelphia Eagles, and I don't see that changing next year whatsoever. Over 286 fantasy points in full PPR, 84 receptions, over 1,400 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns, a whopping 16.6 yards per catch. I think that you could argue there might be a little bit regression overall for this Eagles offense next season since they were so lights out this year, but I just don't care. I think A.J. Brown is going to have another monster year next year. Even if he regresses slightly, I still think he'll be a top 10 receiver next year, undoubtedly. And I do want to mention DAVANTE Smith did not make the top 10 list by a hair, but he finished as your wide receiver 10 on the season. You guys know I absolutely love DAVANTE Smith going into 2022. I think DAVANTE Smith is going to be another value pick going into 2023. Want to give him his props because he's one of my favorite receivers coming into the season. Did not quite make the top 10 list, but he missed it by just a hair. Nonetheless, A.J. Brown finished as your wide receiver 5 on the season with the Eagles. Undoubtedly, I think he has another great year in 2023. All right, another receiver that I really love going into 2022, really encourage you guys to have on your draft boards, was AMON-RA St. Brown. Finished as your wide receiver 7 in full PPR scoring formats at over 256 fantasy points in full PPR, 137 targets, 100 receptions, over 1,100 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. Not to mention he missed a game, you could argue a game and a half. At the end of the day, just a really nice step forward from his rookie season for AMON-RA. And this Lions offense is moving in the exact direction that you want to see a young offense move in. I think that the Lions are going to improve what they did on this past season when we look at next year. And overall, AMON-RA just looks like a superstar. I really think he's going to be another receiver who we really want to target heavily going into the 2023 fantasy football season. All right, number 10 overall, I've got Jaylen Waddle. There are a lot of receivers we could have looked at when it came to the number 10 spot. And at the day, I just felt like Jaylen Waddle really deserved it. I mean, you got T. Higgins, Keenan Allen, got Debo, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, Scary Terry, DJ Moore, Jerry Jeudy, Amari Cooper, DeAndre Hopkins, Mike Williams, all kinds of options here for the number 10 spot. But at the end of the day, what Jaylen Waddle really brought was just a ton of consistency this season. He finished as your wide receiver 8 on the year. Overall, 248.9 fantasy points in full PPR, 112 targets, 70 receptions for 1,300 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, a whopping 18.74 yards per catch. Waddle, who I absolutely loved coming into the season, just got it done this year. And while I really think that Waddle's ceiling is always elevated when Tua is the starting quarterback, he still got it done with Teddy Bridgewater and Skylar Thompson throughout the year. Really just played a very solid sophomore season that I think kind of got overlooked once he stopped giving us those crazy high ceilings that we saw kind of at the beginning of the season when this offense was on fire. But overall, a very solid season. Like I said, your wide receiver 8 on the year. Still only gave you single-digit fantasy performances in 5 of his games on the season, and outside of that, 10 or more fantasy points in every other matchup. A really good year for Waddle. And next season, I think that this Miami Dolphins team, once they are healthy, continues to improve on what they did this past season. I really love Waddle going into 2023. I think he's going to be a very consistent player once again. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button if you guys are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and drop a comment down below. Let me know who was your favorite wide receiver on your personal fantasy roster this season. Let me know what you guys think about the list overall. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.